Hi, I'm Sean Wildermuth. Welcome to Coding Shorts. Today we're going to be talking about Vue's Composition API. I've been working with the Humanitarian Toolbox on one of their tools, and I've been introducing the Composition API there, and it occurred to me I'd never really discussed it in one of these shorts. So let's dig into why I like the Composition API over the Options API. If you don't have any experience with Vue, this might be a little over your head, but I think you can see some of the core concepts. Let's get started. So let's talk about Vue and the Composition API. I've got a pretty simple application in Vue, Vue 2 in this case, though it could have been Vue 3 as well. But I want to show you the Composition API working in 2, knowing you can use it side by side. But right now, this code is just using the option syntax. So let's just collapse that template for a minute so we can really focus on this. This is the default that you've probably used for a long time in Vue. We can see it's passing in some property values to this component, has some data associated with it, has an event handler, has a computed, and even has some methods. And we're using all of those to make this really simple application work. The problem I have with how the Options API works is there's just a lot of magic here, and I'm more comfortable just in code. So what's the magic I'm talking about? So here, I'm using this initial value to know that it's going to be magically added as a property that's being passed in. That's fine, but that means this pointer is magically being set with data that's not about the scope of this function. And this continues. This count inside the computed, the counts here inside the methods. I know that this pointer is being sort of jumbled up with the property values, the data values, a bunch of specialty pieces to make this all work. And I was really happy with this until they introduced the Composition API and showed me that I could think about this in a much simpler way, a much more obvious way. If you're comfortable with the option syntax and you don't want to change, you don't have to. It's continued to be supported, and you can go ahead and click on next video now and skip it. But I'm going to talk about converting this into the Composition API and show you why I prefer it. Now, because we're in Vue 2 in our particular case, I'm going to need to add, go ahead and go to my PowerShell real quick. I'm going to need to add a library at Vue/Composition API. It's only required if you're in Vue 2. If you're in Vue 3, it's going to be there by default. But let's go ahead and install it. And then I just need to do a little bit with our main.js in order to bring it in. So what we want to do is import Composition API, or whatever you want to call it, from at Vue/Composition API, the package we just brought in. And then we need to just plug it in, because this is a plugin into Vue 2. Again, this piece is not necessary for Vue 3. Put the Composition API there, and now it's plugged in, so we can now use the Composition API. So how would we go ahead and change this? Now, one thing to note is our main Vue here is also using the Options API. I don't need to actually change this. This isn't an either or. I can decide to use it in some places and the options in other. And if you have a big project, you can start integrating Composition API without having to make the choice to change all your other pieces. They end up being the same internal structures. Let's go back to our counter view, get rid of that, clean that up, and let's first talk about it. The first thing we need to do that's different is we need to import a define component. This is a function that comes from, not surprisingly, Vue Composition API. And note that in Vue 3, this is the same include. So everything else we're writing except for what's in that main.js or main.ts is going to be essentially the same. There's a few little differences, but not enough to worry about. With that defined component, we're going to export a default object. And instead of that object just being this, we're just going to wrap it with define component. We're going to put this down here as well. And what's being passed in here is going to be different than this structure. What we're going to do instead is it has a couple of pieces to it. The main one is going to be an item just called setup. And setup is just a method. And we're going to be doing most of our work in setup. And this is what kind of makes the magic work for me, is that setup is a way to create a scope where you're going to do all your sort of interactions. So let's talk about that. We have some data here. So I'm going to steal this data and put it in setup, because just like before, the goal of setup, just like the data function that we had been using, is to return some state that we want to be able to bind to. And the state, instead of data just being the properties, it's also going to be any computed objects and methods. And we'll see why that becomes interesting in a minute. This isn't going to really be valid yet. We'll get there. And so what we're going to want to do is create these objects as local variables. So let's say name is equal to counter, and count is equal to 0. And we'll get to the initial value in a minute. And status equals starting up. And then what we would usually do in the return is just return these. Now this would be fine, except for what we're returning here, we're not telling it whether it's reactive or not. And this is one of the places where some people get uncomfortable, but I like knowing which parts of the APIs are reactive and which aren't reactive. And so here, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this in a call called ref. And we're going to get ref from the same API. That's basically saying this is a changeable, or more importantly, an observable piece of data that we're going to be able to change on the fly. And so when we change this value, the template will be able to re-render itself with this change. And I'll do the same thing for this. Now, ref is normally used for scalar values like we're using here. If you had object values, you might want to use something called a reactive wrapper, but we're not going to get into all that. We're just going to focus on this kind of simple implementation. Now, if we wanted to have these methods here, let's grab these, and I'm going to bring them into our object here. And instead of them being methods, I'm just going to make them simple local functions. Because what's interesting about what's happening here is, again, we're creating a scope where we can do our work, and then what we're returning is the entire bindable surface. So the on add, on subtract, and on reset are just different things that our template can bind against, right? Because sure, we're binding to the count and the name and the is even here and all of that we've kind of seen so far. But we're also binding to these methods or these functions that can be called when you do on click. And so the composition syntax says it's all bindable. Why are we separating them into these sort of discrete pieces? That's sort of an interesting part. And then what happens? Why would we bring them all in here? Because all we're using are closures. So in our case here, because this is a ref, we have to set the value of this to ++. But the this pointer goes away because there is no magic here. This is just a closure, right? This exists, and this can have access to it because it has a reference to what's in the outer scope of this function. And so this stays around because of that, and I can reference this just simply because it's JavaScript. Becomes that simple. Now, yes, having to use the .value might be a little onerous versus the other version, but it also means, oh, you know what? If I change name, I'm going to get a different object here. So it's not really reactive in any sense. And it doesn't have to be because, of course, I'm just setting this once. I'm never changing this, whereas these two I am changing as time goes by. And so what about these props? The prop format actually doesn't change here, but how do we get at those values? We get at those values because setup allows us to have an argument called props. And then props is just an object, right? Props.initial value, right? This just becomes a type that has what is in this prop. There's no more magic that some of this is coming from properties, some of this is coming from methods, and some of this is coming from properties. And so that's most of what we needed to change. Let's come down here to computed, right? We have this function that we want as the values change to be notified about it. So what do we do here? We create a constant, which I'll call isEven. Let's go ahead and add that to our bindable surface down here. And what are we going to assign it with? Instead of assigning it as a function, we're actually going to use another import from Composition API that just says computed. And this takes a lambda or a function that returns the value. Of course, this count doesn't work anymore. Again, it's a closure. So if count.value equals that, then computer is going to be that. And so let's get rid of our value here. And now we have almost everything. The only other piece we have that we haven't really dealt with is this mounted, right? What is the mounted? Mounted is just a function that does something. And in fact, we can say on mounted and import from the composition API to say, oh, when you want mounted to be called, what are we going to do? We're going to follow the same thing. And because the status.value equals loaded, because the status is in that closure, again, the syntax becomes incredibly simple. Now, we don't need to return on mounted, right? Because all we're doing is saying, hey, when this component is mounted, call this, and calling this method wires that up. And so we have all the same pieces here. The code isn't really that much shorter or longer, but I find this much more satisfying to work with JavaScript. Now, if we save this and go over, refresh it, you can see that everything continues to work, even though we're using the composition API now. No different, just that we can get a better sense, or at least I think we have a better sense of what's going on here. There's less magic involved. There is a special kind of setup here where it will, instead of having to create the setup, you can just sort of create it as a body. Not a big fan of it, so I'm going to continue to use it in the whole JavaScript. Because again, for the most part in Vue, I want less magic, not more. The other reason this becomes really important to me is composing. So it's called the composition API. One of the reasons is that while we've defined everything here, we could certainly have put this into some reusable piece. So what if I had an import here that says counterfactory as a name? I don't actually have this code, but I'll just say counterfactory. And you could imagine that I could then import counter by just calling the counterfactory or any other way that you want to get this. This may be a shared object. In this case, it might be creating all the functionality. And then all of these can just be, and then let's say both of these are part of that, right? We could get rid of those and just say count.name and use those instead, where this has all the logic. So it could be this reusable piece. Doing this with the option syntax requires creating a mixin that knows how to do all that magic. This is just straight up JavaScript TypeScript, right? It's no super magical thing that's happening here. It's just saying, oh, you know what? The functionality that I'm dealing with here is just part of this, right? It's just something that I want to have in a separate composable piece that I might want to use in a number of places. Of course, I haven't done this, so I'm going to bring these back. And let's go ahead and comment this out. But this composable piece is a big part of it. So you can start to see how, while this may seem a little verbose, if you had to use this functionality in more than one place, you don't have to create a component necessarily. If it's a behavior only, you could define these as reusable pieces that aren't just about components or views. You can finally compose things in a very JavaScript or TypeScript way using the composition API. Hope this has cleared up a couple of things, or at least convinced you to take a look at it. My name is Sean Wildemuth. This has been Coding Shorts. Thanks for joining me.